In this video, we are going to spend a little bit of time setting up our Webflow environment and then doing some of the initial API calls into Webflow, mainly to retrieve information. And then depending on timing, we may also do a post or an addition of collection items into Webflow. But if you remember last time, we set it up so we were getting news articles out of the Newscatcher API and returning that information back and storing it in the Xano database, just like this. And now we're going to switch over to Webflow and start from scratch on this. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new project so that we have some collections to work with. So we're going to go ahead, and I don't want to start from scratch. So I think since we're doing articles, I think going with the blog structure, and we'll just call this news feed. Then we'll give Webflow a moment to add that project to our dashboard. Okay. And as soon as we have it added, here we go. It's got a nice structure to it. This is dynamic out of the collections. Obviously, the posts are dynamic out of the collections, and I think authors, but I don't know that we're going to do anything with authors. If you look at the collections that exist, we have authors, categories, and blog posts. And then not sure which ones we're going to start with, but I do know that we're going to pull some of the default SiteId, collection ID information out of the Webflow APIs. I've been using the Webflow CMS API reference and using the curl examples like we talked about in the last video to set up external API calls in Xano. So we're going to use a pretty similar model for that. Okay, so starting point is in Webflow. To be able to call any APIs after you create your site, you need to get the API key. And that is off of this upper left menu in the project settings. And then you come over to your integrations tab and then pretty much head down to the bottom. So we're looking for API access, and we're just going to pick generate API token. Guess I don't have to copy it that way. We're going to copy that. And we're going to come over into Xano. And I don't know if we went through this in the first video, but in the settings, you have environment variables. Let me refresh this. In the settings, you have environment variables. I'm going to add in a new one, which is where we're going to store our Webflow API key. So that's the API key I just copied off of Webflow. And this will give us, in this workspace in Xano, access to the Newscatcher API key like we were using, as well as now the Webflow API key. So on any API call we make into either of those systems, we'll want to reference this environment variable so that so our API calls are authenticated, or yeah, authenticated. Okay. So we're going to go back into the library and functions. This is probably renamed. I made the mistake when I was preparing for this video that I deleted all my functions, including the one I created in our first video. So I went ahead and recreated this. It operates the same way, makes the API call, creates a variable of the list, loops through and puts those in the database. And I tested to make sure it works again, but I just mentioned that some of the variable names and such may look a little different because I can't remember if I named them the same. But everything works the same as it did before. So just as a little oops, I deleted too much moment. So what we're going to do is, since I'm going to switch over to that as I talk about it, in the Webflow CMS API reference, we need to know what our site ID is, and we'll need to know what our collection IDs are. And so to do that, I'm going to call the list sites API. And so I'm going to steal the curl command and go back over to Xano. and we're going to add a new function, Webflow, let's just call it get sites, retrieves the site information from Webflow. And so this one won't take any inputs, but we are going to do an external API request like we did for Newscatcher and use the import curl so that we don't have to configure it ourselves. And you'll see this is what I had copied. It has the, I think with Webflow, they don't substitute your token in there. So what we're going to do to kind of prove that point, some API references will auto replace your auth token, your key, into the curl commands and other code, and others just have a default non-functional one. So if I save this, we can try to see real quick which one we have with Webflow. Okay, yeah, so it's just a default one, not our real one. So we're going to fix that real quick. You can see the 401 unauthorized. And so what we're going to do is, I think we want to take this section out, and then it's just going to be sites for the URL. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to reuse that base URL. I'm going to save this in a dysfunctional fashion, but I'm going to go back to settings because we're going to want to use a Webflow base URL multiple times. Webflow base URL. And we're going to save it with the backslash on it. And I mentioned that just so we don't duplicate it later. Go back to our functions and get sites. And I'm now going to create a variable that will be the Webflow get sites URL. And it will have, get rid of that. It will use the environment variable to filter this down a bit. And it will use the Webflow base URL, and that has a backslash on it. And then what I'm going to do is add a filter. So we're going to concatenate the string that is, I think it was sites. Let me switch over. Yes. So we're going to attach this onto the base URL. We're not going to use the separator because we just want it attached right onto the backside of that. Okay, so we have our base URL set up. Anytime you add something to the function stack, it puts it at the bottom. So I'm just going to drag it up to the top because we need that variable before we call the API. And so now for the URL, we're going to use the Webflow get sites URL that we just built off of the environment variable and the concatenated sites string. Then everything else here should be correct except for we're going to go into the authorization HTTP header and click on the value. And what I'm going to do is get rid of the token because that's an invalid token. But I do want to point out that the space that I'm leaving after authorization : space bearer, that space is important and you want to leave it there because we're going to add on the environment variable. Oh, let's see, we're going to concatenate. That's where I was heading. We're going to concatenate the environment variable that is the Webflow API key. So this means since we have it in an environment variable, if I ever change my API key for security reasons or for doing this with another site, I can change it in one place in the settings and it'll pick it up everywhere that I'm using it. So at this point, I should be able to save this. And let's see what we have here. As always, I was Need to change this to be Webflow Site Response. And just to make sure that everything worked, I'm going to pick Webflow Site Response. We're going to save it and then run and debug. And now let's see. So now in my header, my response header, I have an HTTP 200, which as it says, it means it worked correctly. So that's important to see. And then also the result is the site information. So it's in an array, but it's only one JSON object, and it has all of my site information. But the key thing that I want here is the _ID, because this will get used in our next API call. So the reason we're creating this get sites API is so that we can get this ID, and we can then pass it along and use it in other calls. That way we don't hard code it somewhere in a variable or something like that, because it could change. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new variable, because even though everything worked, I need to be able to store just that ID. And so I want to call that SiteId. So I'm creating a new variable, and I'm going to pull that out of Webflow Site Response. And then I am going to do my JSON dot notation, because I know that it's in response result. And I believe it was, I think that's all I have. We'll see. We'll go back and check, or I'll just run it and prove myself wrong. But then what I want to do, since it isn't an array, even though it's an array with only one element, I'm going to use a filter to, let's see if I can type correctly. I am going to use, we're going to find it this way. I'm going to go to array, and I am going to say first. I could say last as well, but since there's only one, and I know I want the first element out of the array, I'm going to attach first. So it's going to look here, pull the first element out, and then what I want to do is I want to get. So get can be used in place of the dot notation, but in this case, when I do an array, I'm kind of needing to do the get because I've already attached a filter that was the first filter. And so all I'm going to do here is I want to tell it that for the first element it pulled out of the array, that JSON object, I want to find the property that is _ID, and I want that to be stored in SiteId. And so now what I'm going to do is, as opposed to showing us the full response, I now just want it to return. This function will only return the SiteId. So let's go ahead and see if I got that right. There it is. So that is the unique SiteId for my newsfeed Webflow project. And that is something that we're going to use in subsequent API calls. And just as kind of a note on why we did it this way, the thought process here is I will use this function in the subsequent functions that I create, and those subsequent functions will do external API calls into Webflow. And just to give a picture of what that looks like, Webflow Git Collections. Do my documentation real quick, retrieve the full list of collections from the Webflow site. Okay, so let's see how quickly we can put this one together to give you an example of what it does. Before I actually start throwing information in here in the function stack, I'm going to go back over to my newsfeed project. Remember, we were in the integration tab because we were doing the API key. I'm going to go back to my project. I'm going to load that back up. And just as a reminder, what we're doing with Git Collections that I was just talking about is we want to get the information for each one of these authors, categories, blog posts. And by information, I don't mean the items that are in here, which I use that term very explicitly because that is how they'll get referenced in the Webflow API documentation and APIs we use. I'm not getting the items, I am getting the configuration information. And I'll show you what that looks like here shortly, but this is what we should see in our results with some additional data. Okay. So I know that to get collections, I need to use the site ID. So let's go ahead and use a custom function, and it's get sites, which we just created. And the output is going to be a site ID. Oh, did I click on that, or are we just running really slow all of a sudden? There we go. We were running slow. So let's just call that site ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and just take this in really tiny steps. I have site ID. I am going to click here and switch this to be that. So really what we're doing in another function is just running our other function we just wrote, just to make sure that, there we go. So I know the function's working. I know I'm getting the variable site ID. So now I know I can use that to do an external call. So let's go back to an external API request. And we're going to use the import curl again. So I'm going to switch back over to our documentation. And this time I'm not doing sites because I've already done that. I'm going to come down to collections, and I want to get a list of collections. So I just take theirs. I'm going to do the import curl in Xano. And you'll see that we have all of this being the same. But now what I'm going to add is I still need to add sites, but then I need to have the unique site ID that we just retrieved. This isn't it. If you remember, ours started with a 6, I think, and then attach collections onto the end of that. So we're going to go ahead and import this one, even though it isn't set up perfectly yet. And before we get into fixing our URL like we did in the last API call, I'm going to come in and clean up our bearer token, leaving the space after it. And I'm going to add a filter. I keep saying I'm going to add a filter of concat. So I'm going to concatenate, and I'm going to go into the environment variables and pick the Webflow API key. Okay, so now I have it set up so that it will authenticate correctly. The next thing I'm going to do is remove this, because if you remember, we're going to do a concatenation. So to do that, we're going to create our variable, into data manipulation and create variable. I'm going to go ahead and I saved it uninitialized because I want to drag it to where I want it so I don't forget. And this will be Webflow Git Collections URL. And we'll come in and we will give it a value to start with, the first part of the string of our Webflow base URL. And then I want to concatenate this text. We're going to do this in a few steps, and you'll see why. I'm going to cut that. So I'm going to concatenate sites / onto it. And then I'm going to add a filter, because now what I need to do is concatenate the site ID variable with a separator. I don't normally use separators, so let's see how well this works for me. So I now have the Webflow base URL. I've attached sites, and then I've attached the site ID with a /. see when we're in there. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a filter onto this. It'll be concatenate as well. And it will just be collections, no separator. So if I've built this correctly, I can now use the Webflow Git Collections URL here. I'm going to go ahead and go into variables. So now I should be getting back, if I did all this correctly, seems like my chances are slim, but let's find out. I'm going to save that. We'll run and debug. Oh, yeah. We're going to go look at Debugger. The reason we're seeing the site ID is because at the bottom, I still have the site ID. So actually, why don't I fix that while I'm showing you what it is? Because really what I want to show, once again, API_1 means I forgot to do what I always forget to do, which is my output. And so we'll call this Webflow Collections Response. And then we will set that. Okay, so now I've got my variables set up correctly, my outputs. And when I run and debug this, okay, let's see what we have here. I've got the request, not so interested in that. I've got the header. So I have a 404 not found, so we already know that we failed. The route, as you can tell, let me make it obvious here. 404 not found, and when I come look at the message in the result, I have route not found, and it's showing me that I put a slash collections based on how I concatenated ahead of the token. So I think I got sloppy in how I was creating my variable here. So let's get rid of this. So I have sites, and now I'm going to site slash is what I have. So I'm going to concatenate the environment or the site ID. Okay, and then, so instead of nesting, that's what you see me doing different here is I kind of try to figure out what I did wrong. Instead of nesting the concatenations, I'm going to do them at the same level to make sure I get them all in the right order. And now I want to concatenate slash collections. And then let's run and debug and see what we got going on. Yay. Okay, so my problem there was I nested my concatenations, which actually caused them to go out of order. I nested some and not others, so it was just sloppy. So the easiest thing to do now that it's working is on my create variable, when you're stringing together the URL, make sure you just concatenate at the same level for each of them, which means do one, save it, and then do the add filter right below it, and that'll keep them at the same level. Okay, so, and as you could see when we did that, the run and debug gave us results, and looky there. We have the results that are authors, blog posts, and categories. And it also gives us the ID of each one, which is the important part of this. Pardon me. The reason for that is as we do additional API calls, the API calls where we add items to collections will need the ID of each of the collections. So at this point, I now have, I think, most of what I need to actually start adding in news articles into the, let's go back to it, into the collections that are in Webflow. So what we'll end up doing in the next video is we will clean out some of these fields and make them match the data more exactly that we're getting from Newscatcher. Like we don't get the full blog post from Newscatcher, but we do get a post description or summary. And so we're going to spend some time in the next video doing our first post call into Webflow and putting an article that we have pulled from Newscatcher. And then even though we've got the basics at that point, we've pulled from Newscatcher, we've connected into Webflow, and in the next video, we'll post an article to Webflow. There's still a fair amount of cleanup we want to do to make this more automated. So there'll be a few more videos after this that get into some of the best practices and architectural thought processes of what data can be stored in Xano to make this a smoother process. So I appreciate you watching, and next time we'll do a post.